Hello and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1949, the 53rd season of the VFL. Before we get to the footy, let's have a look at what was going on in Australia and around the world in 1949. The news and issues that supporters and players might have read in their newspapers after they checked the sports section first. Australia's population reached 8 million for the first time, boosted by the start of the post-war baby boom and increasing immigration from, as the newspapers of the time described it, Britain and the continent. Many of those immigrants went to the Snowy Mountain Scheme, that mighty engineering marvel which would divert rivers, generate electricity and enable irrigation. Construction began in October 1949, continuing to 1974. Fuel and energy supplies are pivotal to the well-being of any country, and Australia was nearly brought to a standstill in the winter of 1949. The communist-led Miners' Federation took on the Labor Chifley government with 23,000 miners striking. There were power blackouts. Gas, which was made from coal at the time, was severely restricted, and industry slowed to a halt. Chifley wanted to show Labor's anti-communist credentials and sent the army into the New South Wales open-cut mines. The strike lasted 7 weeks. When the workers returned, much of the union leadership were in prison, and the union was splintering. The precedent of using Australian armed forces would be followed by several prime ministers in the following decades. Petrol was still being rationed by the federal government using emergency wartime powers. A High Court case in June 1949 declared, with the war over, the federal government rationing powers were invalid. The Labor government scrambled a deal with the state governments, who did have rationing powers, and petrol rationing was reintroduced in November. During the election, the Conservatives declared they would end rationing. A swing of over 6% saw Labor lose office, and Menzies became Prime Minister. The new PM used wartime reserves of fuel to deal with the surge in demand, and the spectre of rationing and fuel shortages would never trouble Australia again. Well, maybe never. In world news, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, was created in the territories occupied by British, US and French forces. The Soviet-controlled sector became the German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany. In June, France declared the creation of the new independent state of Vietnam. French forces had already been fighting the communist Viet Minh forces since they tried to return to the French colony in 1946. Declaring the colony as a now independent country was not going to end that struggle. United States troops began their withdrawal from the southern half of Korea, which they had occupied since the end of World War II. That's a good sign for the future peace and prosperity on the Korean peninsula. Meanwhile, in Europe, NATO was created to provide joint security against the Soviet Union, who had been an ally just 4 years earlier. In September, as the Chinese Civil War continued, the Communists under Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Just 2 days later, the Soviet Union exploded their first atomic bomb. The Americans were no longer the only ones with a bomb. To our north, after 4 years of fighting and the loss of more than 4,000 Dutch soldiers, 980 British soldiers, mostly from India, and the death of 100,000 Indonesians and the displacement of 7 million refugees, the Netherlands finally recognised their former colony of the Dutch East Indies as the independent country of Indonesia. In the music business, 45 RPM singles were introduced by the RCA, allowing consumers to purchase an individual song on a small record. Now, they just needed those baby boomers to grow up and for rock and roll music to be invented. It's coming. In literature, George Orwell's novel, 1984, was published, bringing some never-to-be-forgotten phrases into the language, such as the ever-present Big Brother. It was not just a reality TV show, although former Sydney and Adelaide player Ryan Fitzgerald did manage to create a TV career after appearing on the Big Brother TV show. I wonder if he ever read the book. Essendon won a premiership in 1984, but that's for another episode. In the food business, there was the birth of a snack that has kept many supporters warm at the game. McDonald's French fries were introduced in 1949. Then, the French fries were cooked in a mixture of 93% beef tallow and 7% cottonseed oil, giving you all the energy you needed to cheer for your team. Though the beef tallow has long disappeared from the ingredients for the modern-day Macca's French fries, the fast food sponsorship remains. Focusing more on sport now. April 1949 saw some spectacular news for Melbourne. By a margin of one vote, 21-20, Melbourne defeated Buenos Aires for the right to host the 1956 Olympic Games, the first time the event would head to the Southern Hemisphere. As the 1940s came to a close, some modern innovations began. North Melbourne had a new recruit, Laurie Shipp. His main claim to fame was being the first VFL player to wear contact lenses. They were hard lenses, a world away from the daily disposable soft lenses worn today. They cost about £40, which is around $2,800 in today's money, and took 15 minutes to insert when he played or trained, but they made it possible for the 19-year-old to reach the VFL. Before we get into the VFL season, let's have a quick look at how the VFA survived 1949. Sadly for the association, they were back to surviving, rather than thriving as they were before they went into recess during the war. Crowd numbers were down. The game was not the fast-moving spectacle that throwball had originally unleashed. Packs of players scrambled in slow-moving mauls that often deteriorated into on-field violence. There were fights between spectators, with the occasional ground invasion combining players and supporters into brawls, as well as an umpire being knocked out in the race at the Port Melbourne football ground. None of this helped that code's reputation. On top of all these challenges, the removal of petrol rationing mid-year made it easier for people in the suburbs to travel to VFL games or do anything that required travel. Spending time at your local VFA game did not look so compelling anymore. In this atmosphere, the association delegates slowly conceded the need to align with the Australian National Football Council. That would mean they could maintain the permanent agreement with the league, and they got the dubious honour of a non-voting seat on the National Football Council board, with the prestige of playing at the 1950 Interstate Carnival in Brisbane. It was the end of the association's challenge to the league dominance. They never got to the point of being treated as an equal, as planned by the ambitious pre-war president J.J. Liston. The association would survive for another 4 decades, gaining strength when they moved to Sundays with the live broadcasts of the Match of the Day in the 1970s. Yet the player wage inflation of the 1980s and 90s crippled many of the clubs, and the association would eventually be taken over by that long-time nemesis, the league. Whether it would have played out any differently if they had agreed to the limited promotion relegation system that had been on the table after the war is impossible to tell. But if you want to get a real insight into a fascinating period of Australian football, check out the book The Football Wars by Xavier Fowler. Well worth a read. In one final echo of those recruitment coups launched by the association before the war, former Collingwood full-forward champion Ron Todd was playing his final season with Williamstown. They made the grand final, and with his last kick, in the final moments of the game, he passed to a teammate in a better position, who kicked the premiership-winning goal. Todd ended his career on 999 career goals. He could have had a shot at goal, but the team was always more important than the individual, and he was a true seagull now, with 2 VFA premierships at Williamstown to match his 1936 flag won with Collingwood, a phenomenal player who was an integral part of a fascinating period of the game. There were 4 new coaches appointed for the 1949 season, about average for this era, and they included a couple of names that would eventually become icons for their clubs. Jack Hale was appointed for his first full season at South. He had been caretaker coach at South Melbourne after Bill Adams left in June 1948. Bull had been caught out after another defeat. He had been asked if his players were pulling out of challenges. His fateful reply was, "No, none of them are frightened, but they are not vicious enough." The use of the word vicious did not go down well. Adams admitted he'd meant robust when he tried to explain the situation to the committee, but they did not believe he had the confidence of his players, and so his resignation was requested and provided. The new coach, Jack Hale, had spent his 123-game career at Carlton between 1933 to 41, and was considered by many to be best on ground in their 1938 premiership against Collingwood. His career was cut short at the age of 28 when he badly broke his leg against Richmond. He coached Carlton's reserves team for 5 years before taking over South Reserves in 1948. After that mid-season caretaker elevation, he now had a full season to show his talents. Geelong appointed Premiership coach Reg Hickey as a non-playing coach 8 years after he had quit when the club did not support him as a playing coach. He replaced Tommy Quinn, his 1937 Premiership vice-captain, who had been in the job for 3 years, making some progress but not reaching finals. Hickey promised they would be a fit team, but he also said, "It serves no purpose to make idle threats or vague promises. I feel that we've got the right material, fit and playing well, and the material that will build up strength as it gains experience." The more controversial coaching appointment was at Melbourne, where Alan LaFontaine, the former Premiership captain and chairman of selectors, replaced retiring Premiership coach Checker Hughes. Many, including most of the players, assumed their spiritual leader, Norm Smith, would get the job. The committee's vote was so tight that Bill Flintoff, the committee chairman, had to use his casting vote from a hospital bed. LaFontaine had the job, and Norm Smith, after 15 years at his beloved Demons, had no alternative but to leave and begin his coaching career elsewhere. Norm Smith went to Fitzroy, replacing Charlie Cameron, who had only lasted 1 year with that dreadful 8-game losing streak in the second half of the 1948 season. Smith intended to be a non-playing coach, but the Fitzroy Committee insisted the 2-year appointment would only happen as a playing coach. Melbourne cleared him to play. They owed him that measure of decency, and they also thought he was pretty well cooked as a player. Norm's brother, Len Smith, had spent most of his playing career at Fitzroy and gave his brother some insights into the club. Len also began coaching the Fitzroy under-19s in 1949, the start of the illustrious coaching careers for both brothers. I don't normally discuss new recruits. They usually need a season or 2 or 3 to establish themselves. But there was one new recruit in 1949 that is still a topic of conversation today. John Coleman could have been playing VFL football in 1948, but his uni results were so disappointing, his parents demanded that he avoid that distraction, so he spent another season at Hastings. 10 out of the 12 VFL clubs were trying to get him to their team. However, he'd signed a Form 4 agreement with Essendon that effectively tied him to the Dons until the end of 1950. The most persistent club was Richmond, with Jack Dyer and Secretary Maury Fleming making many visits, and, in the true spirit of the Coulter law that forbade any transfer fees or inducements to sign, they offered over £1,000 to stay out of the VFL for another season. The Tigers also tempted Hastings with large cash offers if they refused to clear Coleman for the 1949 season. The Hastings Committee might have thought about it for a moment or two, but they would not stand in the way of the young man who had helped them win the last 2 premierships, kicking 136 and then 160 goals in the last 2 seasons. Coleman did use all that interest to do some negotiations with the Bombers, getting a written commitment that he would play every game of the season. It was an easy commitment for the club to keep. On the topic of recruitment, as revealed in the Round 1 football record, Fitzroy's delegate, Percy Mitchell, was discussing the potential for a father-son rule, which would have priority over residential qualifications. The father-son rule is often credited to Melbourne's desire to have Ron Barassi Jr. play with his father's club to honour his wartime sacrifice. But seems like the idea was already on people's minds well before Ron Jr. was ready to be recruited. The season started on Saturday the 16th of April as a split round over the Easter long weekend, delivering a healthy 137,000 attendance across 6 games. As in 1948, spectators who got to the games early would see under-19 games as curtain raisers, except at Collingwood, who were continuing to support the local schools competition that had provided so many players over the years. An ongoing dispute at Windy Hill, whether baseball or football should be allowed to be played before the big game, was resolved when the local council gave their young footballers the ground in 1949. The Football Record wondered if season 1949 would unearth a top-notch goal kicker, given the lack of key forwards in recent years. They would get their answer pretty quickly. North Melbourne had been playing VFL football since 1925, but had never won at Victoria Park, and after round 1, they still hadn't broken that hoodoo. Fitzroy gave Norm Smith a win in his first game as coach, defeating St Kilda. Geelong surprised many with a 62-point thrashing of last year's premiers Melbourne, while Carlton were too strong for South, and Richmond thrashed Footscray, the team that had pushed them out of the 1948 finals in the final round of that season. The highlight of round 1 was John Coleman's debut. He received many good luck telegrams, even one from Richmond who wished him well in his new career. He was playing on another debutant, Hawthorn's fullback Fred Wayne, who had won that club's best and fairest in the seconds in 1948. Umpire Harry Beitzel, in just his third game after he made his debut in round 18, 1948, bounced the ball and it was quickly sent into the Essendon forward line, hitting Coleman on the chest. He kicked straight and had his first goal with his first kick in league football, with the game barely 10 seconds gone. By the end of the first quarter, he'd kicked 5 goals, and Hawthorn's captain-coach moved Wayne to the half-back line, and Lionel Johnson, who had at least 33 games experience over 3 seasons, went to Coleman. It didn't matter. Coleman had anticipation, leading skills, and a marking talent that exceeded any expectations. From that first game, spectators, including most of his teammates from Hastings, moved from one end of the ground to the other to better watch this exciting full forward as he kicked 12 goals too for the day. The best goal-kicking debut ever, and the equal best on an opening round. The Bombers had found a forward who could kick straight. Fred Wayne kept his place in the Hawthorn team, but life did not get much easier for the new Hawk fullback. His round 2 opponent was Jack Dyer, who had played 297 more games than Fred, and he spent the day at full forward, kicking 6 goals. A tough start to Fred Wayne's 34-game league career. Injuries are a part of every footballer's life, but when a pane of window glass in the change room falls and cuts your foot, well, that's just adding insult to injury. The unfortunate player was Fitzroy's fullback Reg Nichols, who missed 1 game after that post-training mishap at the Brunswick Street Oval. Perhaps Hector Lacey was right when he pointed out the poor condition of the Brunswick Street Oval and the evident lack of investment in maintenance or improvements at the ground over the decades, despite the thousands of pounds from gate receipts that had been given to the Ground Management Committee. While building supplies were limited with the post-war housing shortage, surely players and spectators deserved better. Anzac Day fell between round 2 and 3, and in Victoria there was no football or anything else happening on Anzac Day. It did create plenty of conversation, with the South Australian RSL president saying they had no problems with a solemn service in the morning and sport in the afternoon, so long as any funds raised went to support distressed soldiers. The Victorian RSL maintained their commitment to a very strict observance of Anzac Day. The VFL would have to wait until 1960 to play football on Anzac Day. In our modern era, we have become used to the concept of opening round, where the league schedules some games in the northern states to help promote the code. It might seem a new idea, but it was actually under discussion in May 1949. While some delegates were enthusiastic about the first round being played interstate or in regional locations, other clubs feared upsetting supporters, losing revenue, and incurring greater costs. With no TV to show the games to Melbourne-based supporters, it would have left fans without footy for an entire week. It did not happen in 1950, but one round was played interstate in 1952. We'll discuss that in a future episode. Round 6 saw the season about one-third complete. Carlton were on top with 5 wins, ahead by percentage over Fitzroy under new coach Norm Smith. Richmond, Essendon, Geelong and Collingwood were all on 4 wins, and South were 8th on the ladder with 3 wins in what was looking to be a very even season. Not travelling so well were the reigning premiers Melbourne, who had recalled Jack Mueller for 1 game given their shortage of key forwards. They had only won 2 games and were 9th, followed by Footscray, who had also played finals the year before, but now just had 1 win, and then St Kilda and Hawthorn, yet to get a win. Not unusual for either team in this era. If you've listened to earlier episodes of the podcast, you will recall the Argus and Australasian journalist Old Boy, who covered the game from the very earliest years of the VFL. Reg Wilmot was his name, and he reported on many sports, always promoting the ideals of amateurism over the dreaded creep of professional sport. Recognised by the league with the gift of a mahogany log box for his 46 years of service when he retired in 1935, Reg was also inducted into the Australian Football Hall of Fame in the media section in 1996. His writing was a wonderful source for much of this podcast. Reg Wilmot died in May 1949, aged 79. North Melbourne were very lucky in their Round 7 match against Geelong at Arden Street. The game had been close all day, and scores were level when the bell rang to end the match. But the umpires did not hear the ring over the roar of the crowd. Players at the end of the ground, nearest the timekeepers, shook hands and began to move off the ground, while play continued at the other end for another 20 seconds. A smother, a quick pick-up by Jim Malone, and a goal to North. Umpire Sawyers was returning to the centre of the ground for the bounce, chased by Geelong players, before he heard the bell and ended the game. The result would stand, because the game is not over until the umpire signals the end, except in the 2006 Siren Gate game in Devonport, but it did lead to more calls for sirens, as used in South Australia. Footscray had been using amplified bells via 4 speakers around the ground for over 14 years. Geelong now had a siren so loud, spectators in front of the timekeeper's box were complaining. Richmond were trialling a siren at Punt Road, and Carlton deployed a new siren in June. Match reports confirmed that a siren was being used at the MCG during the finals. The time of the old cowbells was coming to an end. To the joy of players, league delegates voted in May to increase the weekly payments under the Coulter Law to £4 per week. There had been an attempt to increase the payments a year earlier, which was opposed by some of the smaller clubs, but now the required 75% majority was achieved. Of course, there were some players that might have been getting paid more than the Coulter Law allowed, and those cash handouts from generous supporters were never counted in the Coulter Law. Yet, St Kilda players would have to wait. Their committee decided in June that payments to general creditors took priority, and the cash-strapped Saints would continue to pay players just £3 per week. Not for the first time, and not for the last time, St Kilda players would miss out on payments. The club hoped to make up the difference at the end of the season when the finals distributions would help the cash flow. We'll see. In round 9, Fitzroy played Melbourne for the first time this season. In the morning before the game, Norm Smith was in tears, his mind completely blank as he drove a young Rombarassi in circles to and from his mother's place. For 15 seasons, he had done all he could to help Melbourne win every game they played. Now they were the opposition, Adding insult to injury, Alan LaFontaine had instructed players not to shake hands nor to talk to their former teammate. Melbourne supporters, who had cheered him as their hero and been thrilled with that 1948 premiership, now jeered and booed whenever he went near the ball. While Norm Smith was struggling against his old team, over at Punt Road, on that King's Birthday Monday holiday, the top two teams, Carlton and Richmond, clashed at Punt Road. A record 46,000 people squeezed into the ground. They broke fences, they sat alongside the boundary line, or they tried to find somewhere that they could see the game. Havel Rowe, then a young wingman for the Tigers, recalled later that it took him 30 minutes to get from the turnstiles to the change rooms. The Blues won by 15 points. As a point of comparison for that crowd of 46,000, Richmond's Punt Road development of the ground in 2026 will deliver a capacity of 6,500 for major events. Different times now. While Punt Road was crowded beyond capacity, the MCG was vacant, as it had been on the Saturday. Hector Lacey in the Sporting Globe berated the lack of vision by the league, leaving Australia's best stadium vacant on the two long weekend rounds, while supporters were standing in mud in poorly appointed suburban grounds. He made the case for shifting games and using the larger crowds to compensate clubs and ground management committees that missed out on the home game. It would take several decades, but eventually the administrators would see the light. Though even now, some speak nostalgically of the old suburban grounds, but they might have forgotten the less savoury aspects of those facilities. At the end of June, the National Football Council met in Melbourne and adopted the new draft of the consolidated and simplified rules of the Australian game. That was important business. But then they got onto the really critical stuff. 30 years before Mike Brady composed Up There Kazali for Channel 7's Football Replay, the National Football Council commissioned a song to our unique Australian code. Jack Hagan, who wrote the lyrics to Along the Road to Gundagai, and Al Don Bradman, wrote the music and the lyrics, and the famous baritone William Laird sung on that 78 RPM disc. Clearly, it was too soon for a 45 RPM single. The delegates at the meeting tapped their toes, began to hum along, smiled, and called for it to be played again. There were plans to release it for radio play, sell the sheet music, and maybe even play it before the start of VFL games next season. Sadly, for the musical ambitions of the council, this ditty did not grab the public's attention, and supporters had a few more decades of peace at football games without music being played over the PA. Thanks to one musical enthusiast, there is a version available on YouTube. I'll put a link in the episode notes at grandfinalhistory.au. The council's meeting in June coincided with the interstate game between Victoria and Western Australia at the MCG, in a week off between round 10 and 11. John Coleman may have only played 10 games, but that was good enough for the state selectors. The Vics had an easy win, and Coleman kicked 4. When league football resumed, Hawthorn travelled to St Kilda, the number 11 team with 1 win versus the number 12 team with no wins. Only 7,000 went to the game, though the crowd may have been impacted by the train, tram and bus services that were banned due to the coal shortage, and the end of petrol rationing meant so many cars were on the road that the city was in gridlock by Saturday night. The Hawks were 6 goals down, and captain coach Alec Albertson was a frustrated man. His half-time address was blunt. If you chaps don't want to play league football, hand in your Guernseys and give them to somebody who does. The message obviously got through. Hawthorn kicked 10 goals to 3 in the second half and won by 8 points. After 12 rounds, the season was 2/3 done. The continuing coal strike meant severely restricted transport options on the weekend, so crowd numbers were down, with many walking to and from games. Carlton were on top of the ladder with 9 wins, followed by the season's surprise packet, North Melbourne, 2nd, and Collingwood 3rd behind the Blues on percentage. Melbourne and Fitzroy were 4th and 5th, a game behind, both on 8 wins. Geelong were having a better season under the return of coach Reg Hickey, but 6 wins from 12 games was going to make finals a challenge. And the Tigers were behind them, 7th, also on 6 wins. Essendon had slumped down the ladder, 8th behind Geelong and Richmond on percentage. The Bombers had lost 4 of the last 6 games, including a 95-point thrashing by Geelong at Kardinia Park in round 11. But then, a 70-point win over Hawthorn in round 12 could be seen as a 165-point turnaround. They needed to turn their season around if they were going to play finals. Hawthorn might have lost, but they did demonstrate an accuracy with their forward moves. They kicked 7 goals straight, the first time since 1899 that a team did not kick a single behind. South Melbourne were 9th on 5 wins, and Footscray's season had not improved, 10th on 4 wins. That defeat of St Kilda gave the Hawks 2 wins and 11th spot. St Kilda were last, with their first win of the season against South Melbourne, at least regaining the Lakeside Premiership for the first time since 1941. Several of the players were seen getting kisses on the field after the game by enthusiastic female supporters. While round 13 was being played, a second 18 Victorian team flew to Sydney to play New South Wales. Each player was issued a ration of candles to use in their hotel rooms, given the restrictions on electric lights due to the coal strike. Players and officials first thought it was a joke, yet they found the candles were almost as good as currency. One of the travelling party was having real trouble getting a taxi, until he declared he had a couple of candles to spare. The Vics, with Jack Dyer given the honour of captaincy, won easily. The main Victorian team travelled to Adelaide during round 14 and came from behind to win by 1 goal, kicked with just 30 seconds left on the clock. In late July, the Herald had a series of interviews with the wives of a number of club captains. The article provides a window into a different time, with the wives all named as Mrs. Jack Dyer or Mrs. Ern Henfrey, etc., as was the custom of the time. The women were described in terms of hairstyle and eye colour, before moving on to life as a footballer's wife. For most, their set days were spent looking after young children and housework, rather than going to the game. It was common to see little of their husbands during the season, with training, committee meetings, selection late Thursday nights, and media commitments. Though Edith Kine put it all into perspective, as many women of her time would know, when she said, "Of course, his hours are erratic, but I don't mind the waiting when it's concerned with football matters. It's nothing like the awful waiting when he was away at war." Puts it all into context, doesn't it? Reminding us of the challenges that the people of that era faced. Round 14 saw one of the more unusual debuts in league football, almost like John Coleman's round 1 efforts, but not quite. Tom Allen was a local Richmond boy who'd started with the thirds and played his first game against North Melbourne at Punt Road. He would never forget the game. He got plenty of the ball. He had lots of shots at goal and ended the day with 9 straight behinds. It did not help his confidence, and he would only play 22 games over 4 seasons. Clash jumpers are a normal part of footy in our modern era, but Collingwood were calling for North Melbourne to wear red sashes on their jumpers in 1949, as North Melbourne looked to make finals for the second time since joining the VFL in 1925. Magpie supporters then, and now, might be surprised to know that North Melbourne was actually the older club, and had worn blue and white striped tops before Collingwood ever took to the field. Back in 1908, North had tried to get into the VFL, so the VFA disqualified them for a short time. North were back in time for the 1909 season, but they had to change jumpers as Preston had been admitted to the association with the same jumpers as North used to use. North then played with a top of blue and white halves with a red sash. When they joined the VFL in 1925, they wore blue with a white yoke. They switched back to their original blue and white stripes in 1933 with the league's permission. At that time, it was suggested that Collingwood and North officials meet to discuss how to deal with jumpers when they played each other. Yet, between 1933 and 1949, nothing was done. Nothing changed for many more decades, But now clash jumpers are common, except for Collingwood apparently, who are a younger club than North. After round 16, with 3 weeks to go, there were only 5 teams in finals contention, though who would take the coveted top 2 spots for the double chance was far from settled. Collingwood were on top of the ladder, with 12 wins, with a much better percentage than North, who had the same number of wins, sitting second. Carlton were a game behind, but a good win could put them to top spot if Collingwood and North lost. Essendon had overcome their mid-season doldrums, having been 8th on the ladder as late as round 13, but 5 wins in a row since round 12 had them in 4th place, a game behind Carlton. Melbourne had the same number of wins, but they had slipped to 5th after losing to North that week by 1 goal. The Shinboners were making a habit of close wins, having held off Footscray by 3 points a week earlier. Geelong could have been 5th with their percentage better than Melbourne, but their chance for finals was gone when they lost to St Kilda. It was the Saints' 3rd win for the season. Richmond were out of the running, and at the start of August, Jack Dyer announced his retirement, giving supporters a chance to see him play out the last few games of a career that had begun back in 1931. Round 17 saw the upset of the season, if not for several seasons, when North, second on the ladder by percentage, went to Glenferrie Oval and lost by 3 goals to the bottom of the table Hawthorn. It was hard to tell which club was more shocked. The Demons thought a 54-point win over St Kilda would help get their percentage closer to Essendon, but the Bombers beat top-of-the-ladder Collingwood by 46 points to hold on to 4th spot. Carlton's big win over Geelong took them to the top of the ladder, followed by Collingwood and North. Clearly, the Blues were not upset by their slow bus to Geelong, delaying the start of the game. A brand new engine meant that the bus could go no faster than 40 kilometres an hour. The players and supporters were all looking forward to the end of the coal strike and a return to normal train services. The league was also glad to hear that normal services would be resuming shortly. It was estimated that attendances were down by at least 50,000 over the 7 weeks of the strike, with revenues down £10,000. Then there were the extra costs to get to games through special buses, some with brand new engines. Clubs who now had to pay players £4 rather than £3 were hoping for a return to big crowds for the last few rounds of the season and the finals. Each team in the 4 had to win to be sure of finals, and Carlton and Collingwood wanted to remain first and second. In the second last round, the Blues and Magpies had comfortable wins against St Kilda and Footscray, and North beat Geelong. The match of the day was between Essendon and Melbourne. The winner would be 4th with a game clear. The match was at the MCG in front of a record home and away crowd of 58,463. The game was close at half-time, but the Bombers were too strong in the second half. A 25-point win meant they were almost locked in for finals now. Round 19 still had some surprises though. The match of the day was top-of-the-ladder Carlton versus third-place North Melbourne. While close at half-time, North held Carlton to just 2 goals in the second half, winning by 56 points in front of 35,000 spectators. North supporters could hardly believe that their team had finished the season top of the ladder. Melbourne had a big win against Hawthorn, but it did not matter because Essendon beat Footscray. The most unexpected result was St Kilda beating Collingwood by 9 points. For the second time in 3 weeks, the team second on the ladder had been defeated by the cellar dweller. It was a great way for the Saints supporters to see the season out, but it meant Collingwood dropped to 3rd, missing out on the all-important second chance. Once more, like so often over the last 5 seasons, Collingwood had lost an important end-of-season game. Before we leave round 19, let's go to Punt Road for the last game of Jack Dyer's career. He ran onto the ground, threw a banner of yellow and black streamers across the race. Perhaps Bill Williams, who played 7 games that season alongside Jack Dyer, summed it up best in Rhett Bartlett's book on the Richmond centenary of league football. 2 knees are gone, 2 thighs are gone, his right hand is bandaged. He's got ulcers, but where is he? In the grandstand? No. on the bloody ground. Dyer had a reasonable game. When the siren blew for half-time, a woman jumped the fence and ran towards Jack Dyer. She gave him a hug and hung a yellow and black lei around his neck. Towards the end of the game, Havel Rowe, in his second season with the Tigers, saw Jack Dyer get the ball in the forward pocket with 5 Geelong players corralling him. Jack drew on all those years he'd spent in the police force. He put his hand up like a policeman stopping traffic, and they all halted, stood still, and he took one step and kicked a goal from the boundary. He just had that presence. The Tigers made sure Jack went out on a win, and with his last kick of the day, he scored his 6th goal for the match, his 45th for the season, and his 443rd for his career. Richmond and Geelong players carried him from the ground, with Geelong supporters joining in the singing and the cheering. Even those hated rivals Collingwood had sent an inscribed ashtray as a memento of the occasion and his career. It was an emotional Dyer who told his teammates, "I love you guys so much, I could kiss you all." It was the end of the Dyer era. One day he'd have a truth column. Dyer here. But that's a different story. North had topped the VFL ladder for the first time ever and would play Carlton in the second semi-final. Collingwood was third and Essendon fourth, and they would play in the first or the elimination semi-final. Reigning premiers Melbourne had to be content with the 1949 Almostus Award for just missing the finals. Richmond, despite outscoring every other team in the league for the second time in a row, only won 10 games and missed finals for the second year in a row, finishing 6th. Fitzroy was 7th, also on 10 wins. Geelong had looked like threatening finals, but fell away late in the season and were 8th. 9th was Footscray on 7 wins, followed by South, who had 6 wins. St Kilda had avoided the wooden spoon with 4 wins, and Hawthorn were last. 3 wins were not enough to avoid yet another wooden spoon heading out to the Glenferrie Oval. The Brownlow votes were counted at Harrison House on the Wednesday before the final started. The result was a tie, with South Melbourne centre-half back Ron Smoky Clegg and Hawthorn's Col Austin both on 23 votes. Under the count-back rules of the time, Clegg, who had polled 6 3-vote games to Austin's 5 3-vote games, was declared the winner. Smoky Clegg sold and smoked cigarettes, so the nickname was obvious. He debuted in 1945, and the 17-year-old was one of those belted early on in the infamous Bloodbath Grand Final. In 1949, he played centre-half back, winning back-to-back Best and Fairest awards at South. He had spent the Brownlow night at a dance with his wife and heard about the win on the car radio as they drove home. They celebrated at his parents' home and dealt with the media the following day. Clegg would receive his medal in March 1950 at the league's annual general meeting. After the 1950 season, Ron was offered the highest-paying football job on record at that time, if he left South and went to New Norfolk in Tasmania. While the VFL Coulter law capped matchday payments at £4 per game, New Norfolk were offering £44 per week. After much tension, he stayed with South, becoming captain in 1953 and retired at the end of the 1960 season after 231 games. In 1989, the league agreed to provide Brownlow medals to those who'd missed out on countbacks. It happened after some very public encouragement by Harry Collier at the 1988 League AGM. Harry had missed out by countback in 1930. At the awards ceremony, Col Austin received his Brownlow medal from Smoky Clegg. Cole told the audience that, in 1949, he'd gone to the cinema, not expecting to win, even though his wife was confident. As they left, there were press photographers and journalists who told him he'd missed out. It was the end of his 85-game, war-interrupted career at Hawthorn, for reasons we'll explore next episode. He then played 3 seasons for Richmond and finished his playing days at captain coach at Box Hill in the VFA, getting them into their first 2 finals appearances in 1957 and 59. Since 2001, the Box Hill Football Club, playing in the VFL and aligned to Hawthorn, has presented the Col Austin Trophy to their best and fairest player. Essendon took on Collingwood in the first semi-final in front of 67,700 people. The Bombers were favoured by most. They had won the last 8 games in a row, thrashed Collingwood in round 17, and the Magpies, who had won the first 11 games of the season, had a mixed time since then. Essendon were taking no chances in their warm-up, using an innovative approach with a piano accordion playing tunes in the rooms before the game. The spectators had waited through rain. The weather was cold, and sadly, for anyone but Essendon supporters, it was a one-sided thrashing. Essendon were up by 7 goals at half-time, and they just keep on increasing the margin. Coleman kicked 6 goals, and they won by 82 points. Jock McHale was dumbfounded by the result and the poor form of his players. Anticipating one of Jack Dyer's famous sayings, "He keeps getting where the ball ain't," McHale said in the Herald Review, "Our fellows were everywhere the ball wasn't. Essendon were where it was." Collingwood had not played in a grand final in the entire 1940s decade. Now, from 1925 to 1939, in 14 seasons, the Magpies appeared in 11 grand finals for 6 premierships. But since 1940, they had not been able to maintain that awesome dominance. What would that mean for the next season as the league entered the 1950s? The 1930s had been lean years for the Bombers, but in this decade they had appeared in 7 grand finals, counting that draw last year, for 2 flags, and could add 1 more to complete the decade in style. But they still had a preliminary final as their next test. In the second semi, North took on Carlton for a spot in the grand final, in front of 70,856, and many experts tipped North to win their first final since they joined the league in 1925. Carlton had plenty of finals experience, and, as Kevin Hogan reported in his review in The Sun, the Blues did not believe in fancy football. North led for 3 quarters and created problems for the Blues with some of their fancy football. But in the final test, in the pressure-packed last quarter, North broke down. When all they needed to do was play straight ahead, they went for handballs to try to dodge rather than kick long. Carlton knew what had to be done to win finals football. The Blues kicked 6 goals in the last quarter. North could only manage 3 and lost by 12 points. It had been an entertaining game, but now the Arden Street team had to face a confident, rested Essendon in the preliminary final. North Melbourne's captain, Les Foote, was in doubt for the prelim. He'd been kicked in the head in the first quarter of the semi against Carlton, and, although he played the game out, he suffered a blackout Saturday night and remained in bed all week. No concussion rules in 1949 though, and Foote was selected. Despite North finishing on top of the ladder, Essendon were the favourites. 69,000 were at the game, and while they were waiting, Essendon were getting ready in their rooms, this week with a piano playing. At one point they were all singing "Bless 'Em All," a popular song of the time. Despite the musical warm-up, North got off to the fastest start in the first quarter, but without damaging Essendon on the scoreboard. The Bombers then took control of the game, with long kicking and high marking. They led by 3 goals at half-time, and it seemed they had the game in hand, although Coleman, who had been given a full-page spread by the Herald to tell his football story of one season, was being well held by North's Jock McCorkle. Jock was one of the best fullbacks in the game and looked to have Coleman's measure. North switched their side around for the third quarter and started playing better football. Their centre line was dominant and putting pressure onto the Bombers' back line. With a bit more thinking, a few more passes to men in better position, they might have made up more ground by three-quarter time. Essendon's lead was just 2 goals. North were pushing. They got a goal, and then Essendon replied. It was pressure football before the most controversial moment of the entire finals series. Deep in North Melbourne's forward line, North's Jock Spencer flew high for a mark over Essendon ruckman Bob McClure. A classic screamer that would give Spencer an easy shot at goal and ramp up the pressure on the Dons. A whistle from the umpire Jack McMurray Jr., but not for the mark. Incredibly, a free kick to McClure. The umpire said Spencer had pushed McClure in the back with his foot as he took his mark. So many marks taken that way during the season and never a free kick paid, said the North supporters. A clear infringement, shouted Essendon barrackers. The decision was made, and it threw the inexperienced Northerners off their game. Now Essendon had momentum, and a couple of quick goals sealed the game. North had played well, but not well enough, while Essendon had done that thing that quality, experienced teams do: win games with confidence as much as skill. There were many arguments about that free kick, but none of them changed the fact that North, in just its second final series, had gone out in straight sets, and Essendon were in the grand final, looking to be the first team since Geelong in 1933 to win the flag from fourth spot. There's a great colour film of the preliminary final on the retrospective YouTube channel. We'll put a link in the episode notes on grandfinalhistory.au. During the week, the Blues had all of Princes Park to train on, having dispatched the cricketers to Arden Street. In the 1948 Grand Final week, Essendon cricketers top-dressed the ground and exiled football training to North Melbourne. This year, the footballers were at Windy Hill, but in a severely restricted, roped-off area between the centre wickets and the practice pitches. The football club were looking to bring premiership glory to Essendon, but the cricketers had to be ready for the all-important district cricket season, watched by hardly anyone. The Blues made no changes to their team, while Essendon replaced the injured Greg Tate with Keith Rawle, who had been 19th man for the previous finals. Gordon Lane took his spot on the bench. George Hassel also came into the team on the Pine, which was a bit of a surprise, given that he had not played since round 14. The unlucky men to miss out were the bench warmers in the preliminary final: Doug Bigelow, who had also been dropped for the grand final replay the year before, and Greg Tate, who had played nearly every game this season, but missed the big one. Bigelow and Tate would both be back at the club next season. Clearly, the disappointment of missing out did not cause a break with the club. Keith Rawle's selection created a unique moment of grand final history. His father, George, made his debut for Essendon in the 1923 grand final win, joining that small club of players to debut in grand finals, while Keith would be playing his last ever VFL game. If you check their ages, it becomes even weirder. George was 33 when he made his debut. He had been part of the group of North Melbourne players who had moved to Essendon when North made a failed attempt to move from the VFA to the VFL by merging/taking over Essendon. It was a complicated affair related to Essendon having to move from the East Melbourne ground and possibly going to Arden Street before they landed at Windy Hill in 1921. In 1923, George was captain coach of the Essendon Reserves before a last-minute call-up to the seniors for the grand final. Nearly 9,500 days later, Keith played his 111th and his last game for Essendon at the age of 24. He became the captain coach of Redden in the Ballarat League, who were offering much more than the £4 per week he would get if he stayed at Essendon. There were a couple of big news items on Grand Final Day. The Soviet Union announced they had exploded an atomic bomb and proposed a worldwide ban on atomic weapons. We know that didn't happen. So let's focus on the other big news. There were rumours John Coleman was sick and wouldn't play. Sadly for Blues supporters, Alf Brown confirmed that he had spoken to Coleman 20 minutes before the game and that he had never felt better in his life. The youngster was still a chance to kick 100 goals in his first year, 6 more needed to add to the 94 he already had. The umpire was Jack McMurray Jr., despite that controversial decision to award a free kick against North's Jock Spencer after many thought he'd taken a great mark. Clearly, the umpires panel agreed with the decision. It was his third grand final after the 1948 draw and replay, and followed his dad, Jack Sr.'s 5 grand finals. His grandfather Arch played for Port Melbourne and South Melbourne in 1888 to 92, and was a member of the club's premiership hat-trick from 1888 to 1890, a very successful football family. The Sporting Globe had surveyed 44 players and officials, and the results were almost even, 23 to Carlton and 21 for Essendon. The Herald predicted Essendon and the Argus the Blues. Put simply, neither team was outright favourite. 90,453 were in the ground, the biggest since 1938, and health department officials shut the gates well before the game started. That caused a problem for Essendon's Jack Jones. He told the story in an early Howie Games podcast that is worth listening to if you haven't done so. Each player received 2 tickets from the club, one for them and one for their wife or a parent, etc. But Jack gave his wife and his mother his tickets and assumed he could buy one at the gate, or talk his way in. The gate attendant was not having a bar of it. The health department had closed the ground and Jack was stuck. But help was at hand when Blues ruckman Chook Howell asked Jack what he was doing standing at the gate. Jack explained, and Chook said he would help. He then walked up to the attendant, handed his ticket over, pointed at Jack and said, "Whatever that bloke says, I've never seen him before in my life." Jack's heart sank. Then Chook turned round, smiled, and said he would sort it out. An Essendon official eventually came to the gate with a ticket. Jack got told off, but he got to the rooms in time, ready for the game. The crowd was so big they spilled over the fence during the reserves game and sat on the ground around the boundary line. I spoke to one person who was on the grass as a kid. He said it was great while the sun shone, but when they were in the shade and the dampness of the ground penetrated, it was freezing. But they got to see the game. The Under-19 premiership had been won a few weeks earlier when Carlton beat Geelong at Princes Park. The curtain raiser game for the crowd was the reserves grand final between Essendon and Melbourne. The Demons had an easy win, and Jack Mueller repeated his 1948 efforts in the seniors, kicking 7 goals as captain coach of the reserves. He had begun his career in 1934, but would still play another 5 games for Melbourne seniors in 1950 and continue to play and coach the reserves until 1954. While the players were getting ready, the umpires were addressed by the umpire's advisor, Bill Blackburn, who said, "Now look, we've got a man at full forward today, the best we've seen for many, many years. Now you make sure you give him every protection." There would be plenty for the umpires to keep their eye on. Players broke through the streamers at the end of the race, paused to have their photos taken, and lined up for the national anthem, with the crowd standing in silence, except for some racing enthusiasts in the members' stand who had to be told to turn their portable radios off during the anthem. Reynolds won the toss and chose the Jollymont end. Moments after the bounce, Ken Hands knocked Essendon ruckman Bob McClure to the ground. He got up slowly for his free kick, and shortly after was again knocked with a heavy bump, to more cheers from the Blues supporters. McClure got another free kick. He knew Carlton were trying to put him off his game as he booted the ball forward. Essendon's Bill Hutchinson got the first goal of the day with just 4 minutes gone. After the bounce, it was Blues skippers Ern Henfrey reeling after a heavy knock. The game was willing, and the crowd was encouraging their teams to go for it. The umpires, led by Jack McMurray Jr., were not so keen and had some stern words with the players that calmed things down for a while. After 10 minutes of play, Carlton's key forward Jack Howell marked over the top of Roy McConnell and kicked the Blues' first goal for the day. Then Coleman got his first goal, but later, after taking a wonderful mark, missed an easy shot, his kick going out of bounds. During the first quarter, Jack Jones was knocked into the crowd alongside the boundary line by Blues half-forward Jim Clark. As he struggled to get up, he heard a familiar voice say, "What are you doing here?" Jack looked over, and in a crowd of more than 90,000 people, while he was playing a grand final, he saw his brother. Jack paused for a moment, said to his brother, who was on the surface of the MCG, "What are you doing here?" and then got back into the play. Essendon were having more of the play, but their forward entries were terrible. Alf Brown's match review said it clearly. Players just kicked wildly, as if they'd never heard of full forward John Coleman. The quarter-time break saw Essendon 5 points up. Essendon started to take control in the second quarter. They were faster than the Blues, who seemed to be playing the man rather than the ball. Jeff Brockenshire tried to flatten Essendon's Bob Syme instead of just tackling him. The big man shrugged it off and kicked the goal. Essendon's Norm MacDonald was all over the ground and had the ball, doing what he wanted. The goals kept coming for Essendon, while Carlton wasted shots. To quote Alf Brown, Carlton, in 10 minutes of play in which their dash and the marking of Howell had given them the initiative, had added 4 points to their score. It was the type of play that loses premierships. The siren then went for half-time, and Essendon's 5-0 gave them a 27-point lead. The game was not over, but they had the advantage. Essendon 7-7-49 to Carlton 2-10-22. This year it was the Blues who were the inaccurate ones. After half-time, Essendon took complete control of the game in the third quarter. McClure was dominating in the ruck to give Hutchinson plenty of the ball, while Carlton seemed to be totally disjointed. 5-1 gave Essendon a 57-point lead at three-quarter time. The players sucked on their oranges for the last time for the season, yet Dick Reynolds was not letting up. He implored his players to maintain their efforts. He had been badly burnt by the losses in the previous 2 seasons and was in no mood to relax. Ted Lehane quietly gathered a few teammates for a chat. They decided that after 10 minutes of play, if they were still in control, they would switch their focus to getting Coleman the 4 goals he needed to make his 100. Oddly, in such a dominant position, Coleman had not had a great game. He had been held to just 2 goals by Ollie Greaves. As expected, the Blues did not challenge. Reynolds passed the ball to Lehane, who was in easy range, but handballed to Coleman, who got his 3rd goal. Shortly afterwards, Lehane even kicked the ball backwards. Coleman marked and goaled. He was on 98. The ball came into the Dons forward line, and this time it was Whopper Lane, ignoring the goals in front of him, to find Coleman, who kicked his 99th for the season. Players were congratulating him, and even that epitome of fair play, Carlton's Bert Deacon, ran to Coleman to have a few words of encouragement. As the clock ticked down, the crowd wanted to see just one thing. Reynolds raced in from the half-forward flank and kicked a low, raking pass that Coleman marked. The crowd hushed and waited. The kick went towards the goal, and the umpire raised 2 fingers. 100 goals for the season. The cheers echoed around the ground, and players from both teams congratulated Coleman. There was no ground invasion. That didn't start until the 1960s. When the siren blew, Essendon's run of missed premierships was over. They'd won the flag 18-12, 125 to Carlton 6-16, 52. Coleman had his 100 goals, but he also had to give credit to his opponent. In a season where he had been belted by many defenders looking to limit his scoring abilities, Coleman said, "Ollie Greaves is easily the fairest and the most sporting opponent I have met. There'd be no fear for football if they were all like Greaves." It was Coleman's first VFL premiership, but the youngster from Hastings had beaten 2 Carlton premiership coaches in the last 3 seasons. This big one, over Carlton's 1945 and the 1947 premiership coach Percy Bentley, and twice in the 2 previous seasons when Hastings had beaten Frankston, coached by Carlton's 1938 premiership coach Brighton Diggins. Coleman was going to trouble many more coaches in the coming seasons. In fact, the intensity of fan frenzy for Coleman was demonstrated again after the grand final. John just could not leave the rooms to join his teammates at the post-match function without being surrounded at the doors by enthusiastic boys and girls wanting autographs, blocking any way out. He eventually snuck out via the race onto the ground. He'd almost reached an exit gate before being spotted and had to race off lest he be caught by the shrieking throng. He eventually made it to Windy Hill to join the celebrations. On the Monday after the game, 8-year-old Essendon supporter and polio victim John Quirk had all his dreams come true at once. He had written to Dick Reynolds in the week before the grand final, asking if he could have his jumper after the game. A bit cheeky, but if you don't ask, you never know. Of course, Dick had swapped his jumper with Carlton captain Ern Henfrey. But on that Monday morning, Dick and Ern took time off work and walked up the driveway where John was sitting on a cot on the front porch. The two captains presented the jumper, already washed and dried, and stopped for a cup of tea with the mother and son. A week later, Dick Reynolds dropped in again with another Essendon jumper in young John's size. He slept in it that night. This attention to polio victims was not a once-off. Reynolds was known for visiting the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital and bringing teammates with him, to the utter delight of those crippled by the disease, most of whom were youngsters. Ern Henfrey also made time to do similar visits. The day before the grand final, he was with 23-year-old June Middleton, who had been in an iron lung, flat on her back, for the last 6 months. It's a reminder of the cruel illness that would strike people down at random. You can only imagine the relief when vaccines became available in the mid-1950s and freed parents from the anxiety of wondering if their children would be safe, a lesson we do well to remember today. As the players rested and clubs began planning for the 1950 season, there were a couple of stories that pointed to the future. December 1949 brought a warning on the potential impact of television based on what was happening in the USA, where crowds at some major horse races were falling, as some preferred to watch at home or in bars equipped with televisions. TV would not be in Australia for some years yet, but it was already causing concern for some forward-thinking administrators. Then the planning committee for the 1950 Interstate Carnival confirmed that some matches would be played at night in Brisbane. Richmond and South Melbourne had played a practice match under lights back in 1935, but this was a first for interstate football, matches where the results actually counted, even if not for premiership points. The future is coming as the 1950s commence, so join us next episode to see how that decade will start. Now, John Coleman played a big part in this episode, and the book Coleman, Untold Story of an AFL Legend by Doug Ackley is a great read. I'll put Doug's details in the episode notes at grandfinalhistory.au if you want to find out how you can get your copy. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from, and remember to click follow or subscribe, or whatever it is, on the podcast app you use. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or you want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.